India, Institutions and Accumulation has been published by Cambridge University Press in October 2016. Hand over the task of introducing our panelist and coordinator to Patera.
Am I audible? Yeah. Thank you, Dharmansu. We have three distinguished panel speakers with us. Dr. Sonali Yadav. Dr. Sonali Yadav is an assistant professor at Indraprasth College for Women, University of Delhi. Her research interests lie in social geography of India, political geography of resources, and political ecology. She has presented her research papers nationally and internationally, has published her research papers in reputed journals across countries. She is not unfortunately present here, so her paper will be read out by Chetna Trivedi, Senior PhD Scholar at CPS, JNU. Our second speaker is Ravindranath Thakur. He is Associate Professor of Economics and Associate Dean, Academic Affairs at Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. His specialization includes development economics, economic policies, and many others. His published works include research articles in many academic journals and chapters in books published by reputed publishing house. Our third speaker is Dr. Kamal Nayan Chaube. Dr. Kamal Nayan Chaube is an associate professor at Dayal Singh College of University of Delhi. He earned a PhD in political science from Delhi University, focusing on tribal forest land rights in India, which later came as a book, Jungle Ki Haqdari, Rajniti aur Sangharsh, published by Bani Prakashan in 2015. Now he is engaged in a major research project with FCSR Delhi, examining the role of Banwasi Kalyan ashrams in tribal regions. Each speaker will speak for approximately maximum time 20 minutes, followed by remarks by chair and panelists. I now pass the microphone to Dr. Chirasri Dasgupta, our chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm grateful to the Creative Theory Foundation and the organizers for having me here once again. And we will start without wasting any time so that we get maximum out of the session. I would, though it has been said 20 minutes, I would request each of the speakers to try and finish between 15 to 16 minutes, so that we have some time at least for discussion. I'm not going to make any comments at the beginning. Depending on how the timing goes at this time, I'll make some remarks right at the end. So I would request Sonali's paper, Chetna, can you please present
microphone.
Sonali's paper?
Am I audible? Is it fine?
Just start.
Hello everyone. Sonali tried her best to be here, but she could not come. Yesterday we were talking about academic freedom, and this is one example of that. She could not get a leave, but she tried her best. So I'll be reading out her paper, which is titled Precarious Geographies of Conservation, a case study of Kanha National Park, Madhya Pradesh. And I'll try my best to do justice to the paper. So the context of the paper is basically located in the fact that conservation-induced displacement, which impacts the livelihood options of the displaced communities, has become one of the most contested issues in the conservation paradigm. The conservation paradigm is premised on the Western model of conservation known as the fortress model. And this is the model which has been adopted by most of the Western and the post-colonial countries in the 19th century. Now, this fortress model is basically based on two principles. One is the hands of nature, and two, no human interference. So basically, when you go on with the conservation with this kind of a model, you evict the people from what you define as protected areas, and you relocate those indigenous communities to some other location. Now, this kind of fortress model has been criticized widely in the 1990s, and it has been said that it is basically an exclusionary approach, which does not take care of proper rehabilitation, relocation, and alternative livelihood options of the displaced people. This also leads to alienation of indigenous communities from their land and source of livelihood. So in this paper particularly, we will look at the Indian story of conservation-induced displacement of indigenous communities as a result of Wildlife Protection Act 1972 and the Project Tiger Initiative 1973. But before we begin with the Indian story, let's just very briefly have, can you change the slide? Yeah, so can we just very briefly have a look at the this shift of the new era of conservation, which this fortress model is all about. It defines environment as an arena in which different social actors with asymmetrical political power compete for access to and control of natural resources. The environment leads to making of protected areas, and then these protected areas are also defined with certain jurisdictions and certain borders. And then there are certain rights also which are to be given to the indigenous communities who live there. This new paradigm is also loaded with slogans, ironically, of sustainability and save environment. But this new paradigm severely actually impacts the indigenous community and conservation. It leads to conservation of one at the cost of another. So it has not been very successful ideally, but this is what globally the countries have adopted. Now, conservation-induced displacement, particularly in India, which is the slide. So India also adopted the fortress model, which emphasized on hands-off nature and human interface, which meant that indigenous communities, basically the tribals, were to be evicted and displaced and relocated from their native place. As part of the discourse, an emphasis on wildlife conservation project and national parks after 1947 was initiated. The Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 was a landmark in the ecological history of India, and it was intensified with 1973 Project Tiger Initiative. The objective of this particular study is to interrogate the process of conservation-induced displacement, to analyze the impact of conservation-induced displacement on the tribal communities, and to analyze the precariousness and vulnerability on sites of displacement. The method which is used is primary survey data collection through an ethnographic survey of the sampled village, which is Kapur Behra. It is located in the Mandla district of Banjara region, Madhya Pradesh. Participant observations and semi-structured interviews are also employed in the field, and it is clubbed with critical analysis of some available secondary and primary literature. Now, why Madhya Pradesh as the site of field? Because MP has 34 protected areas with 6 tiger reserves, 12 national parks and 31 wildlife sanctuaries. MP is also home to one of the most primitive tribes in terms of culture and lifestyle. Why particularly the Kanha National Park? Because it was inaugurated as the first protected area as part of the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. It is a classic example of eviction of primitive Baiga and Gond communities, tribal communities of Banjar Valley, and the eviction has been going on since 1973. The interference of humans are restricted in the protected areas, and as a result, so far 4 million people have been displaced. The Kanha National Park is located in the Mandla district with 51% of tribal population. The Banjar Valley region inside the Mandla district used to have a major population of Baiga and Gond, both the tribes, but in the several decades, 25 villages from the Banjara Valley has been dislocated, affecting approximately 650 families. Now, the case study of Kapur Bahira village reveals to us that it is one of the oldest relocated as part of the Kanha National Park. It is located in the buffer zone of the forest, 8 kilometers away from Khadia Gate, with 90 households. Among the 90 households, there are 42 Baiga families, and there are 39 Gond families, and there are also 9 other families which are not part of the study. The narratives, there are certain narratives from the field, so before we go to the findings, we can just look at the narratives from the field. Can you change the slide? So these are certain narratives wherein the participants have said that we do not practice cultivation, it is like scratching our mother's skin. We lived in these forests and they are everything to us. So basically they can't indulge into agriculture, not just because they have an emotional connect and they think that the land is their mother, also because the soil is not fertile at all in the village. The village has sandy soil, so it does not have the moisture to retain basically the nutrients. So therefore agriculture is not much of an option. They do some agriculture but not at a major extent. So it's not one of the primary sources of their livelihood. The major findings of The case study reveals that Kapot Gehra was relocated in 87-88. Initially, the Baiga and the Gond communities were not willing to go through the process of relocation. They were not willing to leave their land, but then gradually they were made understood about the rehabilitation process. They were promised alternative livelihood resources, and they were also sort of made to understand that it is very important to have the Kanha National Park, and why do we need wildlife sanctuaries, why do we need national parks, and so there was this whole process of negotiation where they were made to understand certain things and the importance of the national park, and therefore they finally agreed to relocate. They were promised that they will not have to depend on forest at all, because initially both the communities were dependent on forest for all kind of resources. So they were told that you won't have to depend on forest and we will have alternative livelihood resources for you, but that did not happen. After relocation, though, the overall picture was dismal. Standard of living comes below poverty line in the village. The economic status of the village became very critical. They can't indulge in agriculture because soil quality is low and inferior, generally comprises of more sand, which has low moisture retaining capacity. So they generally, whatever little agriculture they indulge in, for that also they are dependent on the rain for kharif production, and the cropping pattern is also single. The water resources are very scarce. The major source of water inside the forest was the Banja River. Now when they were relocated outside the forest, the Banja River inside the forest is not accessible to them. A stream of the river is not accessible to them. So the another stream is located 3 kilometers away from the village. So every time they need to fetch water, they have to go 3 kilometers from the village. And that particular stream of water is also polluted because all the waste from the village goes to that water. So this is about the water resources. Some of the major changes which they experienced after relocation include the changes in food basket. So the staple food is something which is called kodo kudki, in which there's a major portion of green leafy vegetables. But then because the water is not of that great quality, the soil is not of that great quality, so there's not much of production of even the leafy vegetables. Milk products are negligible. The Gond tribe community initially, when they were not relocated, they were inside the forest, they used to have, they used to rear cattle. But now, since there are no pastures inside the village, so they do not have any cattle anymore. There are just 2 goats inside a village which has 90 households. So there is no cattle rearing, there is a shortage of milk, there are no milk products. There are no toilets, so they have to go for open air defecation. So there are no water sources and there are no toilets, they have to manage with open air defecation. So, and the story is after 25 years of relocation. The primary health care has been made accessible and possible. There is a small center, just like the Mohalla clinics, which takes care of the health care. The vaccination is taken care of, but despite of that, the risk of water diseases has become very high. Maximum children under the age of 5 are sick and are malnutrition. As far as education is concerned, there is one Anganwadi, there is one primary school. The primary school has 1 teacher, 5 batches and 3 rooms. Ironically, the ratio of girls going to the school, the primary school, is very high. But they drop out once they complete primary school because the secondary school is located at 9 kilometers of distance, so they cannot get secondary education. To conclude, the conservation-induced development often comes with voluntary and involuntary processes of relocation. But the major issue is that even if it is voluntary, what we witness mostly is that the intensity of the loss is too much. So probably they are not explained the vulnerabilities of relocation, not compensated properly, and the rehabilitation process does not take care of itself. The second conclusion is that the political ecology of conservation gives more power to major players, including the government, institutions, corporates and bureaucrats, and also to tourism managers, because tourism becomes very important as it makes nature a sellable community and it also brings some revenue to the state. The sufferers ultimately are the indigenous population and the tribes, and the loss happens at an unprecedented measure. Rights discourse, the discourse of laws and rights, it remains under a rhetoric. It does not materialize itself on the ground as much. So there are certain recommendations and limitations by the author. The author suggests that proper research and assessment must be done before any kind of relocation project in terms of carrying capacity of the region and dependency of population on it. Certain capacity building programs and policies must be included in the process of relocation. Financial assistance must be given in the initial phase of relocation, and some monetary assistance must be kept aside for micro enterprises and cottage industry. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Next presentation.
Thank you, Chetna. That was an excellent presentation of someone else's paper. I really appreciate the fact that you took so much pain to really summarize it in a way where we all got it, and most importantly that you took even less time than that was allotted, which means we've had a little bit of rearrangement has to be done because there's some technical glitch, so we request Dr. Kamal and Shobe to present his paper next, and then because there's some problem with the slides. So please go ahead.
Thank you. I will focus on, or I should say in the beginning that my presentation or my paper is a complementary paper to what Sonali argued in her paper. So basically, I will try to talk about violence created by categorization of tribal population in our country, and existence of different kind of laws in tribal areas, which but I'll also give some example from some other fieldwork experiences. So basically, I hope all of you understand this thing that scheduled tribes is a constitutional categorization has actually accepted many categories who claim that they are tribal communities or they are Adivasis, but they are not part of scheduled tribes. Time Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram has accepted many ideas presented by different tribal organizations related Rights Act. The fact of the matter is that their larger agenda is very much different, and they are, though taking a stand against any kind of violation of laws like FRA, they are supporting or they are working for some kind of division in tribal areas. The another problem with this idea of categorization or the use of different kind of laws at different times is that if a particular tribal community, and here I'm not talking about Rajaji National Park, but in scheduled areas, if you are living in a village and you are facing a problem of mining or displacement and you are opposing the whole process, and actually PESA is giving rights to local communities to decide about it, but if the state authorities are not working and local communities are protesting, the state has developed a unique idea to overturn all this protest by declaring a village into Nagar Panchayat. Because there is no law like MESA, Municipalities Extension to Scheduled Areas Act, which was earlier, the idea was there that a law will be passed by the parliament, but it never happened. So my point here, and I'll conclude by saying that if we look towards this idea of categorization and the existence of different kind of laws, we'll find that actually this has increased the exclusion of tribal communities, and it has actually given the weapon to administration, forest department to repress these communities, and it has created lots of problems for them. The only solution for them is to mobilize themselves and also to work for some kind of clarity as far as this legal structure is concerned, and this is the only way that they can work. But the reality, or at present the situation is that though they have given few rights due to Forest Rights Act, they are not able to claim largely their community rights in different forest areas. And the situation of the implementation of PESA is also really dismal. And as I mentioned, that state or state authorities or forest department has different kind of weapons to suppress them. So this is my presentation, and I generally try to argue that apart from Rajaji National Park, in other areas too, the situation is not good, and the tribal people are facing lots of problems and exclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. That was also very precise, and there are various aspects on which I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion. We now I request Dr. Abhinandan Thakur to present his paper.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. My paper is on agricultural prices and caste class dynamics, vulnerability of farmers in neoliberality. Actually, in neoliberal policies, affect farmers' vulnerability in many ways. Of course, I'm only discussing prices, which is one of the most important indicators. So, if we talk about how neoliberal policies actually affected agriculture as a whole, or rather go by income side, because recently government of India announced that the farmers' income must be doubled in certain years. So if we talk about farmers' income, it actually consumes two sides. One is total revenue and the other is total cost, of course. And this neoliberal regimes actually affected both sides of the agriculture. One is, of course, so if we talk about total revenue side, it's basically yield and prices, which constitute a major part. As far as yield is concerned, it is directly related to research and development, which usually happens in the public sector. And if we look at the overall expenditure which is happening in agriculture sector particularly, it has declined significantly. So that part is clearly affected. And secondly, price, of course, I will discuss that in detail in that paper. Second is cost side. So cost side, with the beginning of neoliberal regime, the first major changes happened in the agriculture sector was cutting of subsidies. So that all kind of subsidies. So that actually led to rise in the overall cost of production. So on the two sides, on the one hand, when productivity increased is very sluggish, price I will talk about definitely in a bit. And then on the other hand, cost of cultivation actually increased significantly, led to a sharp fall in overall profit of farmers. In fact, if we look at many research papers, it clearly shows that more than 2 lakhs of farmers committed suicide during a very brief period of time. So that's actually a kind of reflections of the kind of distress which is there in the agrarian sector. So, okay, so but this paper is primarily talking about price dynamics. About agricultural price, we must see this from two perspectives. One is international, the economy of dominance. Big developed countries from Europe or USA, they usually give huge subsidies to agriculture sector, and therefore the international prices are basically depressed, and they are depressed due to their policies, in fact, because of heavy subsidies. In fact, for some countries, subsidies goes as high as more than 70% of the total cost. So internationally, the price of most of the commodities, agricultural commodities, are depressed because of the agrarian policies followed by most of the developed countries of USA, of course, USA and most of the European countries. And if you look at the price trend internationally, even with the beginning of second half of the 20th century, you find a sharp deterioration of terms of trade or prices with relation to other commodities of agriculture sector. So, barring a brief period, largely price of agricultural goods decelerated or even fell as compared to other for almost in whole world. That trend is very prominent. But in Indian case, before 1991, it was to some extent protected because of it was not an open economy at that point of time, and some kind of protection was actually ensured by the government. So, in fact, therefore, Indian farmers, even during the Green Revolution period, was actually protected from this falling international prices globally. What happened in 1991, the moment Indian agriculture was connected internationally, India was immediately subjected to already falling relative prices of agriculture. And that actually led to sharp fall in the prices of agricultural goods in India. In fact, wheat, cotton, jute, the prices collapsed immediately. So that actually led to a fall in the overall income of farmers during that point of time. Secondly, volatility of farm prices also happened, with the beginning of neoliberal period, which was relatively very much stable. If we talk about domestically, so of course, internationally the price is moving downward. So now India, once exposed to international, international exposure happened, Indian agricultural prices also started falling. Secondly, as with the onset of neoliberal policies, state expenditure in agriculture sector declined significantly. That again led to a rise in total cost. But when we talk about prices, it is usually argued that one of the important way how the farmers should achieve higher price is through bargaining. So in fact, many articles, many research, mainstream papers actually discusses that the individual bargaining is very important in the determination of prices. So farmers, the moment the government doesn't interfere in the price market, so it's basically the sole responsibility of the farmer to bargain for better prices, and they accommodate their cropping pattern, in fact, accordingly. So this paper is, so I'm basically talking about a result which talks about to what extent this bargaining is working in a country. Because whenever we look at the models or mainstream economic analysis, we see that they simply disconnect economic bargaining from the and social aspect. So everybody is of bargaining. That's one of the, in fact, they call it political economy very often, but political economy is only reduced to a two-party bargaining by assuming that everybody is having equal footage in that bargaining, though level playing field is already maintained. So then, when in 2016 it was announced that farmers' income would be double, then in 2019 a new NSS data actually was released, which talked about the farmers actually various aspects of well-being of farmers in India. So this paper is actually based on that. Some results. So I will talk about that. So okay. So in this paper, I actually worked on what is the average price a farmer is receiving through the bargaining process. Because in India there are two kinds of markets, agriculture market. One is which is regulated, of course, in which APCRE, government procurement centers, in which minimum support price is basically ensured to large extent. And there is another kind of market which is unregulated, that is not directly intervened by the government. And minimum support price is a price, most of you already know, that it is somehow makes agriculture barely sustainable. If any price is lower than minimum support price, means you are not earning anything from agriculture. So that's a kind of minimum, that's why it's called minimum support price, you expect higher than that. So now if we compare these two markets, so like regulated market and non-regulated market, that is a normal norms of market, private market and all. So seventh slide. So I simply divided the farmers selling to different market in two broad parts, regulated market and unregulated, which is a normal market. So you see the average price is much higher in regulated market, which is basically ensuring minimum support price. So in fact, non-regulated market, which is a local market, the average price of farmers is much lower than MSP, minimum support price, which is a sustainable price. So that's one of the very important aspects, that farmers who are selling in the non-regulated market or through the bargaining process actually end up with getting much lower than minimum support price there. Okay, and second, next slide. So now, if we simply compare, now another argument is that most of the times when we argue about bargaining, they don't take into consideration the socio-economic inequality which is already there in the bargaining process. So one of the most important aspect of that is size of the farm. Whether small farmers definitely are having, small farmers or marginal farmers do not have equal platform, so they are, they sometimes lose this bargaining process. So if I divide, in this paper, farmers are divided into 4 or 5 categories. Marginal farmers, this area one is area up to 1 acre of land, then 1 to 2 acres of land, 2 to 4 acres of land, 4 to 10 acres of land, 10 acres and above. And if we look at that division, that clearly shows the class of farmers. It clearly shows that while on the one hand, in a regulated market, most of them are getting higher price, and that dotted dot are basically minimum support price of that year. So most of the farmers who are selling in the regulated market are actually getting higher than the minimum support price, while the trend is quite regressive in the market. So you see that the smallest category of farmers ended up very low, in fact, in percentage terms, more than 20% lower than the minimum support prices. And in fact, for only the last category of farmers, which is the largest farmers, are basically on an average securing above minimum support prices. Next. So now, if we talk about, in fact, it is also argued that main reason of social deprivation, why scheduled castes are having lower bargaining power, because they are economically deprived because of historical reasons. Okay, main problem of their bargaining is their economic deprivation. To large extent, it is argued that historically their education level is low, historically their ownership of land is low, historically a whole lot of socio-economic indicators are low. Therefore, they basically not able to bargain for better prices. Now, if we simply divide, the entire farmer population in both area, on the basis of area and caste, you clearly see that even in the smallest category of the land size, scheduled castes are actually bargained for the lowest price. So, in fact, within each of these categories of farmers, scheduled castes are the one who actually bargained a lower price. So it's not only about economic indicators. So in fact, I ran a regression, which I, of course, I'm trying to explain this through the graphs, that even if you take each of these categories of farmers in terms of farm size, you find that caste plays a very important role in the bargaining process. And in fact, in the entire next slide, since time is limited, so maybe we will discuss more. So, in fact, I will only discuss the major points here. So, one is, even if we control for a whole lot of variables like education, if you control for education, you control for age, you control for land size, still the bargaining power of scheduled caste and of course other deprived social groups is much lower. So their price they are receiving is much lower. However, in regulated market they are well off. However, even if you look at in the regulated market, which is government regulated market, still the caste discrimination or size-based discrimination is still there. So this farm size-based discrimination, caste-based discrimination is even present in the regulated market. However, on an average in the regulated market, each and every farmers are getting much higher prices compared to non-regulated market. So, okay, so okay, another point is that there are some, I think there's no point in looking at all those slides because there are many, and let me conclude by giving some conclusive statements. So, in my model, it was also found that those who are having access to institutional finance, they could bargain slightly better. So those who are having kisans at the time of harvest, it's a kind of distress selling. And price, so those who are having access to some institutional finances have some kind of leverage. And now if you go to the profile of the farmers who are getting KCC or institutional loans, you still find excessive inequality, massive social and economic exclusion in the entire system of finance. So there are two kinds of things. So first, deprived caste are primarily deprived in economic sense because they are of course having a small piece of land, they are not having economic means sufficiently. Even if you controlling for that, all economic factors, still you find a caste factor playing a very important role in the overall bargaining process in the local market. So in fact, most of the time it is argued that market is neutral, caste neutral, class neutral, you go and bargain. So that is a completely, if you look at the data, it's completely off the mark. So market is completely, it's fully discriminatory and exclusionary in nature. So I think I will end my talk here. Maybe we'll attack more questions. We'll have more discussions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Thakur. In fact, we would have. So I'll just take 5 minutes to set some broader questions and then open up for the floor. The first is actually the panel, the person who basically designed this panel, to him, and hence the overarching kind of tone which has been set within which we've had the discussion, which is that this idea that vulnerability and precarity is something that is associated with neoliberalism, and that earlier there was some kind of a welfare state which in some ways made people less vulnerable and less precarious. I think there's also a need to question this since we started questioning everything. Because as far as countries like India and other Asian and African countries are concerned, we never had welfare states ever in our history. And so this idea that at some time there was a welfare state, that is a complete myth. And hence this idea that something only associated with neoliberalism and not the larger processes of capitalism is something that one needs to really understand. That is it just neoliberalism, or is it something associated with the different ways in which capitalism works in different spaces and in different time periods. And in that, one can go back to, so that there are a lot of people who have gone back to part 8 of Capital Volume 1 to look at primary accumulation and how that kind of may provide one kind of answer to what we are looking at. And then we see that even for the Western countries, the countries he was referring to in terms of who set the prices, who protect the agriculture today, do things exactly opposite to what neoliberalism demands. These countries themselves, the history of their welfare state is less than 50 years old. Okay, so this idea that the welfare state was an overarching model and neoliberalism is dismantling it within capitalism is something that I thought one should flag for discussion. The second point that something with respect which runs through in the theme for all 3 papers, which are excellent papers by the way, and there's much food for thought, is that it seems to suggest that, well, at least the first 2 papers, that the legal structure around conservation as well as forest, like the rights of forest dwellers, once again challenges this neat separation about neoliberalism being the culprit. Because if you look at the Wildlife Act that was in the 1970s, and that's the beginning of all the problems of displacement of people to protect flora and fauna in a certain way, like anybody except the forest dwellers had right to the forest, was the idea. While through a long struggle, the Forest Rights Act was achieved, in which some minimal rights were at least given. So once again, the neat, even the way our laws have progressed with respect to governance of forests cannot be mapped one-to-one with neoliberalism. Developmentalism itself had certain ideas of what should be conserved and what can be left to be displaced. The third point I want to make, and this is for all 3 papers, which is that while there is a suggestion in terms of we get either through a survey or whatever method, there is a suggestion of dual displacement. So first you are displaced from your habitat, and then where you are located is so bad that makes you vulnerable and precarious, and hence you can become like part of the landless labor force, migrate, etc. That seems to be the story. But one big part missing in this, I think, and this is where it's important to connect, is gender. Because the impact is not the same. Even for the Vanvajars, the activism that has been mentioned, it has mainly been men. Okay? The women are still like not part of the Vanvajar activism in Uttarakhand at all. Like you do not see them even part of the meetings of the Sangathan. Okay? The other is, of course, the important particular question for Sonali, but anyway, she's not here, which is why the Yadavs were not left out of, because if they were also part of the village, why were they left out of the survey? Okay? But the larger point I'm trying to make is that the uneven effects which have been captured in terms of caste communities is not complete unless the story of what kind of effect it has on women or other genders is really fleshed out. The last point I want to make is specifically with Avnindranath's paper, which is that it's a very important intervention in, at least in the domain of economics, because this way of quantitatively looking at caste as a major determinant is really not the usual way in which things are looked at. However, there are two things. One is, with the NSS survey, the problem is that when you you can't disaggregate it, because then the samples become insignificant. But there's a lot of regional variation, because MSP, for example, only works for in places where there is procurement, government procurement, and that is limited to just a few states in the north. No, but so for example, in Bihar, where I come from, there is zero procurement by the government. So MSP or no MSP, it doesn't make a difference. So at that level, this analysis would collapse if you only use NSS data, and maybe you need to think of other ways of establishing this in terms of the regional dimensions. And the last point that I want to make is that the overwhelming suggestion seems to be that there is increase in vulnerability and precarity. The question is whether it's only neoliberalism or there is something else at play. And in that, there's just to flag a point. So for example, if you look at the current period, there are even newer ways of increasing precarity. So for example, violence against particular communities, against particular religious communities, against Muslims in particular, against Dalits, against women, rape, lynching, mob lynching, etc. Engineered violence, mob violence, which is termed riots to suggest as if it is equal, but it's not. All of this leads to this kind of rural displacement, the things that we are talking about in rural areas or in forest areas. You see almost the reflection of that both in rural areas and also in urban areas. And what this does is further, it leads to displacement, either because of fear and insecurity or because of actual impact of violence. Okay? And this then leads to the larger question that what is the purpose of all this? Why is vulnerability and precarity increasing? Okay. Does it labor in Indian context? This is food for thought the floor. So we have sufficient time for discussion. So we can take about 15 minutes worth of comments and questions. So please keep your comments short, questions crisp, so that we can take. Yeah, yes, please.
So thank you very much. It's basically about the conservation and displacement debate generated by two speakers, Sonali and Kamal. I think they have given a very substantive understanding of it. But we need to understand that these things have got
very complicated now. It has deeper dimensions now. So I'd like to just take 2 minutes time. 5, 6 vantage points we need to remember when we're talking about the conservation. One is, of course, Madam has raised about neoliberal. Is it neoliberal alone which is creating vulnerability and precarity? But when we ask this question, probably we have also limited understanding of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is not only about the market corporate. Neoliberalism is also about violence and obsessive identities. And I'll explain it why have I spoken. The second one is how conservation become a kind of narrative of dominant nationalism. I'll give instances why have I spoken about it. And the third is judiciary. What has been the interventions on the part of judiciary that has also generated a lot of enthusiasm towards conservation at the cost of the common people. Now, let me just take the example of, if you look at the Kaziranga conservation debate where a lot of displacements are taking place, it's not exactly only because of the conservation. Conservation is a part of it, but more importantly because you attach a lot of pride to that national park, and that pride to the national park has a lot of relationship with dominant regional nationalism, and that dominant regional nationalism has now been appropriated regional, this displacement in the pretext of conservation. If you look at that, Kaziranga, it is not only about the local people. The target is that this has been, and it has also been facilitated by the intervention of the court. Court, based on the report, had taken so moto case of it, had given a verdict that it is the responsibility of the state, responsibility of government, that you have to protect the park. Because it is also sentiment, it is also pride for the nation. I think these are very, very critical issues when you talk about the conservation. And third, the neoliberalism that I mentioned. Now, neoliberalism has also generated the climate crisis. Now, climate crisis and climate protection. They have a definite paradigms of climate protection, and they don't address the issues of vulnerabilities that neoliberalism is creating, but they think in terms of those issues where they are not being targeted. Now, conservation has also emerged as one of the neoliberal tools of, saving the climate. And therefore, when I talk about, apart from the issues that you have mentioned, you have talked about the tribals. That's very important. Tribals are being targeted. Remember, the Hindutva has also appropriated the tribals and the Kalamzias and the local people. Now, they are using them to protect, fight against the quote-unquote manufactured enemies. I think these are some critical issues that we need to take into account when we talk about the conservation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, people were complaining, nobody looks at this side.
Okay.
Yes, please. I've taken the 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, 6. Yeah.
So, I'm Aparna. So basically my questions to Dr. Thakur was not your priority, or why you haven't included gender as a category of analysis. Or do you think they are not considered as farmers? Thank you.
So next one is, and then.
I'm Arunima. My question is for Kamal sir. So since you talked about excluded categories, so modern Indian project largely lies on this idea of displacement, especially in terms of displacement for construction of religious structures. The communities that are displaced in prominent cities, I come from Varanasi, they do not form a constitutional category. Since you talk about legal pluralism, but it also it's also dependent on tribals as a constitutional category. But in this project, the people who are displaced, since they do not form a constitutional category, it becomes all the more difficult for them to fight back. And there are a lot less researches that are based on on how vulnerability through their lens and precarity through their lens. So how do you respond to that?
I can ask one more question.
This one is, my name is Shubhojit, to Professor Thakur. So this is for clarification, I wasn't able to look at the data very clearly. So on one poll, you're saying that, say, within marginal farmers, the scheduled castes have the least bargaining power. Is it true on the other pole also, say amongst large farmers of say 20 acres or more, do you see the same thing, or does the difference dampen between say OBCs and general castes and the scheduled castes? Thank you.
Okay. In that order, Supriya, you, and then the. Okay. Okay.
I have two questions. One is to Dr. Kamal and Chaube. Professor Dasgupta pointed out something. I just want to build on that. The general way of looking at the issue of displacement or the tribal question is to set it against the state. State versus subaltern becomes the usual frame of looking at the whole issue. And what Professor Dasgupta was pointing out was, there are vulnerable identities and there are certain dominant identities which make use of that vulnerability. So rather than state being the encroacher, certain dominant identities become the where act on the part of the state. So in certain tribal areas, so part of the problem in Jharkhand is not only the state but also the upper caste, upper class elite who have migrated from Bihar and sort of captured the cities of Jharkhand, right? So how would you look at that problem? That social despotism that is generated by dominant communities, that is part of the problem. That is one. So I'm just complicating this usual binary that we have, state versus subaltern. The second is to Professor Thakur. It was a great paper. I'm just confused. Is it prices across years or is it just 1 year?
1 year.
Okay, so is this the trend across years? That is one thing that I would like to know. And is it across crops? So is it just one crop or is it all the crops? The larger question I want to know is why is this anomaly you're seeing only in the agrarian market? I'm not an economist, I'm a general student of social sciences, and if I go to buy a Lifebuoy soap or anything, I have to pay the same price. The logic of commercial exchange is that there is equality on the both sides, that you pay a price and you get it. Irrespective of your identity. So why is it happening in the agrarian market? So is it the case of an unsuccessful transition? What is it that you see this only in the agrarian market, not say in or other commercial marketplaces? So is it there something specific to that? Yeah, thank you.
I have something for the first speaker. You come and use the mic.
Come here.
Use this mic. So, for the first speaker, like when you were, putting the slides, I was just wondering what is the methodology that you have used, because collecting data and accessing that data both are two different things. So I wondered the methodology that you have used, and how do you understand protected areas? Like, how do you define protected areas? Protected areas is not a modern concept, Protected areas has always been there in a very different way. So how do you understand that? And another thing, the second speaker, as well as you, both of you spoke about forest, mentioned about Forest Conservation Act. So I was reading about this recently, where in that article it was mentioned how the concept of forest has also not been defined properly. So which is why there has been a lot of problems. So I think when you mention about Forest Act, I think you should also look into these conceptual definitions, because these concepts does make a lot of difference. And another thing I would like to point out is, like, I have been working in this area, I have been interested in this area, tourism. So when you mention tourism, national parks, they have a lot of tourism activities going on. So these local people living around in the fringe areas, do they really benefit from these activities? Because tourism does give employment, and in many forms it does employ people. So have these people been able to derive any benefits out of it? That is, collecting data is fine, but accessing data really needs to be looked at. That's how I personally feel. Thank you.
Yes, please.
My name is Amit from South Korea. I've been here in India more than 10 years, but I still try to identify. I can ask two questions. In the long-term process, we find the way to promote the competence in the new liberal regime. In the long term, we need to promote the competence. This is the final solution. And what's the way to promote this competence? We can ask this question more and more. We can create a platform. Also, second question. This is because of my lack of understanding on India context. We can develop the new platform, create the extension of regulated market. We have to include the non-regulated sector to include it, and then we can control it in a more equitable way. This is the way. I can ask. We have to ask this question more and more, and we can develop new mechanism, or new commission, or new platform to in the public. This is two questions. Thank you, ma'am.
So, two questions, and one question to chair as well.
That's not allowed.
The coordinator asking questions.
On the state and neoliberalism. Thank you, Avninder, for your wonderful presentation. I remember writings of Chandravan Prasad and Abhijit Banerjee and many others who were writing in EPW celebrating neoliberalism for empowering Dalits in Uttar Pradesh and many other states, and those pieces were celebrated. So, thanks for debunking those myths through this study. I'm just curious to ask or to know that what happens to non-agricultural rural areas? I mean, do you see, and to Kamal, do you see the difference between Ghurye's Hindu element and current regime of Hindu element? Where is the convergence and divergence? Because this Hindu element is not new. It was there in Ghurye backward types or backward Hindus. So what gets new in terms of Hindu element? And to the chair, one is with this welfare thing is this interesting one. I mean that primitive accumulation of capital or disposition or encroachment are already there since the beginning, or I mean, one associate with the neoliberalism, and this is you have alluded this many times, including Prabhat or David Howe. So, are we saying that this is not new? It is since beginning, or in our understanding, it is intensified since 91 and 92 onwards?
5,000 years of old system.
Okay, so we will have.
You wanted to ask one question.
Yes, sorry, yeah, I forgot. Yes. So, but now we need to wind up. So yes, please keep.
Myself, Pankaj Pushkar. There are certain concerns, which means Dr. Kamal Chaudhary has reminded me. So I don't want to overburden him too. It's not a mandate that means the answer. That means with regard to tribals, with regard to Adivasis, we have, social sciences has learned to study displacement. But the question is, has there been a displacement at the ontological level in the very beginning? Do we see that means social sciences which we have been practicing has acknowledged the reality of the Adivasi as an at the very fundamental basis, and also in the making of the entire body of knowledge, the worldview and the entire life experiences of various tribal communities. Could social sciences be creative and inclusive and accommodative enough to accommodate all those epistemological standpoints? That's the one concern, and probably it need not be answered means because these are the challenges human nature. What we find in Bella and Gone coming to interpret ourselves, our own traditions in what we have done, and which is being wider possibilities of taking a rather bigger leap in the domain of cognitive theory. Thank you so much.
Just like one line, okay, which is in addition to Professor Das Gupta's reflection on the gender question, and this is for Kamal, that I think according to recent Supreme Court judgment, there have been extension of property rights to women in tribal regions, and because you I did expect, because we are looking at vulnerability and precarity, so a little more layering, as Professor Das Gupta mentioned, would help.
Okay, so can we now have your responses? So, Chetna, do you want?
I can only respond from the paper, so since Sonali is not here. But as far as the definition of the protected area is concerned, so the author argues that by protected area she means the core area which is defined in the Wildlife Act 1972, the area where which is home to endangered species. So that core area is what she is referring to, the protected area in the paper. The second question, I missed that point, I'm glad she asked. Sonali also argues that tourism has been there in the Kanha National Park, but it does not have any major impact on the livelihood of the Kopar Tehra village, Baila and the Gond community. They usually rely upon finding some work as a labor in MP or in other states. The third question on defining the forest, I am not capable to answer that. And regarding the methodologies, I can only tell what the methodology is written by Sonali. So she first conducted a pilot survey, and then she did an extensive ethnographic survey of the Kopar Tehra village. And she also referred to some archival data resources, district census handbook, and some of the policy papers. From there also, these were also part of the primary resources, and from there she got some of the data. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So,
Come on.
Okay, so thanks for the questions and comments. So I think I see the implementation of Forest Rights Act in PESA as a process of democratization of forest governance. So with neoliberalism, we should also focus on this aspect of democratization in our society, when we can find that marginalized sections are now demanding more and more rights. So we must see PESA and FRA in this context, and also the different kind of problems, complex problems which have emerged in their implementation due to the agenda of neoliberalism. So this is comment. The another thing is related to gender and women activists. So actually I found that many tribal women are working seriously for forest rights in Sonbhadra or in Durban National Park of Uttar Pradesh, where I did some field work. I found that actually women activists are leading this struggle. They have been opposing forest department officials regularly, and they have also mobilized themselves to create some kind of self-help group so that they can use forest resources for some kind of activities, creative things. They can make certain things for market, etc. And also in Forest Rights Act, there is a provision that single women can also claim their rights, and the land title will be given on the name of both spouses, for husband and wife. So I think it's a progressive law in that context. And the another question is related to excluded categories. So I think my argument is that actually categorization creates some kind of problems, but it is also necessary for state policies. And I agree with you that there is need to create some kind of a space for those communities which are excluded from this categorization. But my larger argument in my paper was that actually we can find that this kind of categorization has created a problem, because there are many communities which are excluded, there are many areas which are excluded, and if they, it is not really a thing that if you include a particular community in one category, it will create a wonderful thing for that community. But the point is that many communities are not aware about their status. Many tribal communities, they claim that they are Adivasis, but actually they are not part of scheduled tribes category. So my point is that there is need to simplify this whole idea of categorization. The another thing is, question was related to the role of, going beyond the binary of state and subaltern. So of course, we know that in many areas, including Jharkhand, there has been the problem of Dekho. Jaipal Singh Munda raised this issue. Jaipal Singh Munda raised the question on the giving employment in the industry of Tata to only Bihari people. So this kind of thing is there, and I think I feel that making a law like MESA would create a good things in urban areas of Schedule 5. Because he has to. So it has been a different kind. There has been different kind of issues why this law is not yet enacted by the Parliament. So we can discuss it sometime later. But I think the solution is creating a separate law giving clear rights to tribal people in urban areas. And tourism question, I think I also feel there is no benefit to tribal communities to this whole idea of tourism. And Pankaj Bhai's question about ontological and epistemological aspects. I think the problem with the tribal studies has been that tribals have not much space in this study. Though if we read the literature, not social science writings, but literature, literary writings of like Nerula Putul's writing and other people's writings, we can find that they are questioning the whole idea of knowledge presented by the mainstream academia. And as far as Dhananjay's question is concerned, I think Gurie's idea of backward Hindus is an attractive idea for Vanvasi Kalyan Ashram. And but I don't think that Gurie is talking about exclusion of other tribal communities, but their politics is based on exclusion of other tribal communities, creating a kind. So I generally feel that the situation of a Muslim, we can find that Muslim is a category for Hindu nationalists, where they can question that category or that person or that community always as as a dangerous community. Okay, so they are using the same tactics with those Adivasis who are Christian or who are not presenting themselves as Hindus. So from the beginning, their politics is working like this. So this is the basic difference. Yeah, this is.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so many things, but I will be very brief. So first, chair's remarks. So basically, okay, one thing I forgot is rice cultivation, because rice cultivation is spread over pan-India. It's spread across all caste and class. So you get that in detail. So it's not there in case of other crops. And I have, as chair suggested, so I have already incorporated all sources of selling. So all the local market, input dealer, everything is there. A part of it is, of course, institutional selling, which is very, very limited. So more than 90% of the farmers are selling to the local market, and those records are there. And in fact, another very important point, like I have also controlled for the states which is actually having higher procurement. So in my another paper, which I found that there is a very strong relationship between government procurement and local prices. So in the states in which government procurement is higher, local prices are also higher. So that another paper. So for that, I have also controlled for 6-7 states which actually have higher procurement. And then very interestingly, gender questions. I have actually incorporated gender also. And very surprisingly, I found a positive relationship. In fact, female are selling at higher prices. So that result actually somehow surprised. So then I looked at the data. Then I found that most of the farmers, female farmers, were belonging to those states which already having higher procurement, like Kerala and others. So that there was a state effect associated with that. And unfortunately, number of female farmers are very low as compared to male farmers in India. And if you divide further, it doesn't, statistically you cannot prove anything. But it's very interesting thing. You can have a, that's very important aspect. But still, I have to work on that. As far as a different class is concerned and caste, up to 4 years, you find a very strong discrimination. Okay, up to 4 years of land. But over and above 4 acres of land, 4 acres of land, you find a diminishing kind of discrimination across castes. In fact, I just not mentioned here religion. In fact, Muslim farmers' condition is even worse on an average than scheduled caste. Most of the times their selling rate is even lower. And and in fact, the case was in 2009, 1819 case, but it's also there in 1213. The trend is there, but unfortunately, 90s and early 2000 data doesn't show a price, received by the farmers, so you cannot have that data. But it's there. Why disparity is there? Even you go and buy consumer goods, those are not competitive prices. There are only 2 consumer goods sellers in the entire world who control 70 to 80% of the market. So whatever you are paying, that's also not competitive prices. So, but here, even though the sellers are relatively larger as compared to that, but still it's a one-to-one bargaining process. That's why the socio-economic conditions actually plays a very important role. And in fact, most of the farmers in selling at a distress, because they are already indebted. In fact, one of the factors which I did not discuss that informal loan. Those farmers who had informal loan, they actually tended to sell their produce at an even lower rate because they had to pay loans. In fact, owners and tenant farmers actually tended to sell at a lower rate. Then, so there are many factors which are there, which I did not have much time to elaborate upon. And non-agricultural area is a big kind of thing, so maybe we can discuss later. Okay, thank you. So I think.
Okay, thank you so much. This has been like a very enriching discussion session and also the responses. I will just make a one-line response. It is important to look at the very premise of everything being traced to just what happened after, let's say, whether you take 1970s in the international context or 1990s in the Indian context, kind of takes away certain processes of creation of precarious conditions which are absolutely necessary for the functioning of the system. So it's been different ways and different. The only period in history is the period of from the Great Depression to, let us say, 1970s. It's a period of hardly 40-50 years. And also this is the culmination of the anti-colonial struggles also, that we had states saying. So I'm sorry I didn't how it's turned out. Thank you so much, and I think we break for tea.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Latana. We will be breaking